On the 12th of May, 1780, a little after 2 in the afternoon, an American army walked out of a burning city and stacked its weapons in a field. There was no music. That detail matters more than it sounds, and we'll come back to it, because the silence was deliberate, and it was still being avenged 18 months later. 5,466 men, by the figure the British recorded. 7 generals, 311 pieces of artillery, 6,000 muskets, an entire naval squadron, most of it already sitting on the bottom of the Cooper River where its own Commodore had sunk it. The Continental Army's entire southern department, every regiment of it, walking into captivity in a single afternoon. It was the only occasion in the Revolutionary War when a complete American army, not a garrison, not an outpost, but an army with its general, its guns, and its colors, was handed over intact to an enemy. And it would remain the largest surrender of American troops for the next 82 years. Nothing would match it until Harper's Ferry in 1862, in a war Americans fought against each other. Here is what makes it strange. The British had just won the most complete victory of the entire war. They had taken the wealthiest city in the American South, destroyed an entire field army, and cost themselves fewer than 300 casualties doing it. On paper, on that afternoon in May, the rebellion in the South was finished. 17 months later, they lost the war. Over the next couple of hours, I want to show you how that happened. How a siege that ran with the precision of a mathematical proof produced a strategic catastrophe for the winners. Why the American commander spent 6 weeks trying to save his army and was physically prevented from doing it, not by the British, but by the people he was there to protect. What a Hessian rifleman lying behind a sandbag 200 yards from the American guns actually saw, because 2 of them kept diaries, and those diaries survive. And why the deadliest single event of the entire siege happened after the surrender was signed, to men who had already given up their weapons. We'll also deal with a question that bothers me about this battle, which is why almost nobody has heard of it. Ask a room full of people to name a Revolutionary War battle, and you'll get Lexington, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Yorktown. You will not get Charleston. And the reasons for that turn out to say something uncomfortable about how nations decide which parts of their past to keep. If you like this kind of history, long, careful, built out of what the sources actually say, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps. And we are now also live on Spotify. So if you'd rather listen to this than watch it, the whole thing is there. Now, to understand why 14,000 British soldiers and sailors were standing outside Charleston in the spring of 1780, we have to start with a British army that was, by every measure that mattered, losing. By the end of 1779, the American Revolution had settled into the worst possible shape for the side that was supposed to win it. Britain had the larger army, the better trained officer corps, and the most powerful navy on earth. What it did not have was a way to end the thing. George Washington had spent 4 years perfecting a strategy that drove British commanders to distraction. He refused to fight unless the odds favored him. He traded ground for time without apology, and he understood something his opponents were slow to accept. That as long as the Continental Army existed somewhere, the rebellion existed. You could take a city. You could take 10 cities. You could not take an idea that kept walking away from you into the countryside. 2 events had made this stalemate genuinely dangerous. The first was Saratoga in October 1777, where an entire British army under John Burgoyne was surrounded and surrendered in the forests of upstate New York. Militarily, it cost Britain perhaps 6,000 men. Diplomatically, it cost them the war's balance of power, because it convinced Paris that the Americans could actually win. which produced the second event. In 1778, France entered the conflict as an American ally. What had been a colonial insurrection became a global war. Suddenly, Britain was defending the West Indies, Gibraltar, the Channel, and India at the same time as it was trying to suppress a rebellion 3,000 miles from London. Troops that had been earmarked for America went elsewhere. The Royal Navy, which had enjoyed absolute freedom of movement along the American coast, now had to worry about French fleets appearing over the horizon. The political pressure in London became intense. Lord North's government needed a victory it could point at, and it needed one soon. Out of that pressure came the plan historians call the Southern Strategy. The reasoning behind it was not stupid, though it rested on an assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong. British intelligence, much of it filtered through exiled colonial officials who had every incentive to tell London what it wanted to hear, insisted that the southern colonies were full of loyal subjects being held down by a violent revolutionary minority. Georgia and the Carolinas, the argument went, were royalist country under a thin crust of rebellion. Crack the crust, and the loyal population would rise, arm themselves, and hold the ground while the regular army moved north. It was a strategy that required the local population to do most of the work. That should have been a warning. There was also a precedent that seemed to confirm it. In December 1778, a British force took Savannah, Georgia, with relative ease. Then, in the autumn of 1779, a combined American and French attempt to take it back was thrown off with heavy losses. The southern coast looked soft, and the tool that had worked at Savannah, a methodical amphibious operation against a port city, looked repeatable. There was one obvious next target. It was the largest city south of Philadelphia, the richest port on the American coastline, and the political heart of the whole region. And Sir Henry Clinton had unfinished business there. It is difficult now to convey how wealthy Charleston was. In 1780, it was the fourth largest city in North America, and by most measures of per capita wealth, comfortably the richest. Its fortune rested on rice and indigo, and those crops rested on slavery on an enormous scale. South Carolina was the only mainland colony with a black majority, and the plantation economy that produced Charleston's merchant houses, its music, its libraries, and its imported furniture also produced a permanent, unspoken anxiety among the people who ran it. That anxiety is going to matter to this story, so hold on to it. Geographically, the city sits on a peninsula. The Ashley River runs down its western side, the Cooper down its eastern. And where they meet, they form a deep, sheltered harbor, one of the best on the entire seaboard. It is a superb commercial position. As a military position, it is something else entirely. A place with water on three sides and one way out. That single land approach was called Charleston Neck, and everything that happened between March and May of 1780 comes back to it. The harbor had one further peculiarity. Its entrance was guarded by a sandbar, a shifting, shallow ridge that large warships could only cross at high tide, and even then, with difficulty and some risk. Johann Heinrichs, a captain of Hessian riflemen who kept an unusually sharp diary through the whole campaign, noted the strategic logic plainly. This was the one fortified harbor in two provinces capable of balancing against French and Dutch trade. And once you held it, that sandbar meant a small squadron could keep it. The British had tried once before, and it had gone badly. In June 1776, a Royal Navy squadron attempted to force the harbor and ran into a half-finished fort on Sullivan's Island, built out of palmetto logs and sand. Palmetto is a spongy, fibrous wood. Instead of splintering under cannon fire the way oak does, it absorbed the shot. British broadsides sank into the walls and stopped. The American guns, meanwhile, punished the anchored ships for hours. The squadron withdrew, humiliated, and the fort was renamed for its commander, William Moultrie. South Carolina put the palmetto tree on its flag and has kept it there ever since. One of the officers present at that failure was Henry Clinton. He had been given command of the land element of the operation, had been unable to get his troops across to the island, and had watched the Navy get shot to pieces from a position where he could do nothing about it. He spent the next 4 years living with it. Which brings us to the man who was going to try it again, and to the far less enviable position of the man waiting for him. Benjamin Lincoln does not have a heroic reputation, and that is partly the fault of this campaign and partly unfair. He was a Massachusetts farmer who had risen through the militia and then the Continental line on a reputation for reliability rather than brilliance. He was heavy-set, methodical, sometimes described by contemporaries as slow. A man who reportedly had trouble staying awake in meetings. He had fought well in the northern campaigns, including at Saratoga, where he was badly wounded in the leg. The wound never fully healed. He walked with difficulty for the rest of his life. In January 1779, Congress gave him command of the Southern Department, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. It was a promotion that looked like an honor and functioned like a trap. The Southern Department was not really an army. It was a collection of Continental regiments from 4 states, state militia units with their own loyalties and their own enlistment expiry dates, and a handful of foreign volunteers spread across a theater the size of Western Europe with almost no logistical infrastructure to hold it together. Lincoln's authority over the militia was negotiable in practice. His authority over the state governments was non-existent. He had also, the previous autumn, presided over a disaster that almost nobody outside specialist circles has heard of. And it deserves a moment because it explains a great deal about what happened next. In September 1779, a French fleet under the Comte d'Estaing arrived off Georgia with several thousand troops. Together with Lincoln's Americans, they laid siege to British-held Savannah. It was the first major combined operation of the Franco-American alliance, and on paper, the numbers were overwhelming. It went wrong almost immediately. D'Estaing was working to a deadline. His fleet could not stay through hurricane season, and he was under orders that pulled him toward the Caribbean. Rather than conduct the slow, methodical siege the position called for, he demanded speed. The formal approaches had barely begun when he insisted on storming the works directly. The assault on the 9th of October, 1779, went in against prepared British defenses and was cut apart. The Allied force lost something in the region of 800 men in about an hour. The Polish nobleman Casimir Pulaski, who had built the American cavalry arm essentially from nothing, was mortally wounded, leading a charge. D'Estaing was wounded twice. Within days, the French re-embarked and sailed away, and the siege collapsed. 3 consequences followed, and all 3 were still operating in the spring of 1780. Lincoln lost troops he could not replace, in a theater where recruitment was already difficult, and militia enlistments expired constantly. The American cavalry in the South, Pulaski's creation, lost its founder and much of its cohesion, which will matter enormously when Tarleton comes looking for it. The Franco-American alliance, barely a year old, acquired its first bitter experience of each other. American officers thought D'Estaing had abandoned them. French officers thought the Americans had oversold the ease of the operation. That mistrust took time to repair, and it meant no French relief force was going to appear off Charleston in 1780. And in London, The successful defense of Savannah confirmed exactly the wrong lesson. A British garrison had held a southern port against a numerically superior Franco-American force. If Savannah could be held, the reasoning ran, the southern coast could be held, and the whole southern strategy was worth expanding. So the campaign that destroyed Lincoln's army at Charleston was authorized partly because Lincoln had failed at Savannah 6 months earlier. By early 1780, he had somewhere around 5,500 men available for the defense of Charleston, and that number requires an immediate caveat that will recur throughout this story. Almost every figure connected to Charleston is contested, because the sources disagree about who counted as a soldier. Some tallies count only Continental regulars, which gives you a number closer to 3,500. Others add militia, sailors from the scuttled fleet, and armed townsmen, which pushes it past 6. When we get to the surrender itself, we'll see that this disagreement is not a rounding error. It's an argument about what an army is. Lincoln understood his position clearly. Every professional officer under his command understood it. Charleston was a peninsula. The British had a fleet and a garrison that allows itself to be sealed onto a peninsula by a superior force with naval supremacy is not defending a city. It is waiting to be counted. The doctrine of the war was unambiguous on this point. Washington had built his entire strategy on it. The army was the cause. Territory could be lost and retaken. An army, once surrendered, was gone. Lincoln knew all of this. He tried repeatedly to act on it. He was not permitted to. And the people who refused him were not British. Sir Henry Clinton had by 1779 become Commander-in-Chief of British forces in America, which was a position he had wanted and then found he disliked. He was a genuinely capable soldier. He read terrain well. He understood siege engineering, and his tactical instincts were frequently better than those of the men above and around him. He was also anxious, prickly, and convinced that his subordinates and colleagues were failing him, a conviction he committed to paper at length, which is why we know so much about his grievances. 2 relationships defined his conduct of this campaign, and both were poisonous. The first was with Vice Admiral Marriott Arbuthnot, who commanded the naval side of the expedition. The 2 men disliked each other almost immediately, and their correspondence deteriorated from there. Clinton blamed the admiral for delays, for logistical failures, for a general absence of urgency. Whether the blame was fair is debatable. That it soured the operations command climate is not. The second was with his second-in-command, Charles, Earl Cornwallis. That relationship would eventually collapse into open hostility and, after Yorktown, into a public campaign of mutual blame conducted in print. In the spring of 1780, it was merely cold. Below them, though, Clinton had 2 officers of frightening competence. Banastre Tarleton was 25 years old, commanded a mixed force of cavalry and infantry called the British Legion, and was in the process of becoming the most feared man in the American South. He was fast, he was aggressive, and he was entirely comfortable with a degree of violence that his own colleagues sometimes found excessive. Patrick Ferguson, commanding a loyalist unit called the American Volunteers, was a talented and inventive officer. He had designed a breech-loading rifle with a genuine gift for organizing loyalist manpower. Clinton's plan for Charleston reflected everything he had learned in Severn-Sebrynetsk. He would not try to force the harbor. He would not assault the city. He would land far away from it, march overland, seal the peninsula, and then reduce the place by formal siege, the slow, geometric, almost bureaucratic method that European armies had used against fortified towns for a century. It was a plan designed to produce a certain result at the cost of time. And it required, first, getting an army from New York to South Carolina in the middle of winter. That turned out to be the hardest part of the entire campaign. In late December 1779, Clinton sailed from New York with roughly 90 transports and 14 warships, carrying somewhere above 13,000 soldiers and sailors. The voyage should have taken about 10 days. It took 5 weeks, and it very nearly wrecked the expedition before it began. The fleet sailed into one of the worst winters recorded on that coast. Johann Hinrichs, the Hessian rifle captain, was aboard the Apollo, and he counted the days. Of 36 spent at sea, 15 were storms. Not weather, storms. He described ships rolling so violently and so loudly that sleep became impossible, night after night, for weeks. Some transports were blown clear across the Atlantic. One vessel carrying Hessian troops ended up in England. An ordnance ship was lost. And the horses, this is the detail that changes the campaign. The horses died. Cavalry mounts do not survive prolonged storms at sea. They cannot brace themselves. They panic. They injure themselves against the stalls, and they cannot be kept fed and watered in a hold that is pitching 30 degrees. By the time the fleet reached the Carolina coast, practically every cavalry horse in the expedition was dead or ruined. That meant Banastre Tarleton arrived in South Carolina commanding a mounted force with nothing to mount. And it meant that his first strategic priority, before anything else, was to find horses, which he did aggressively by taking them from the countryside and eventually from the Americans themselves. Remember that, because it will produce the single most decisive action of the campaign. On the 11th and 12th of February 1780, British light infantry and Hessian grenadiers came ashore on Simmons Island, what is now Seabrook Island, roughly 30 miles south of Charleston. Nobody opposed them. That was the point of landing there. What followed was a slow, miserable, unglamorous slog through the Sea Islands. Heinrichs, who had by now developed a settled loathing for South Carolina, described marching through deep sand, marsh, and woods he considered untrodden by human beings, and asked his diary what kind of country this was to fight a war in. The British moved from Simmons to John's Island, across the Stono River to James Island, working their way around the city's southern and western flank. It took them weeks. Every mile of it was made harder by terrain that swallowed wagons and by an army that had arrived seasick, cold, and short of everything. Washington, watching from the north, understood exactly what was being set up. He also understood that he could do nothing about it. Sending significant reinforcements south meant releasing his grip on the British garrison in New York, and that he would not do. Charleston would be defended by whoever was already there, which meant the question became, what had they built? The answer is that they had built something genuinely formidable, and this is the part of the story that usually gets skipped. Because Charleston sits on a peninsula, the entire landward defense could be concentrated on a single line running across the neck. From the Ashley on one side to the Cooper on the other, the Americans, working with French engineering officers, men like the Chevalier de Laumois and Colonel de Cambrai, whose expertise in this specific kind of construction was worth a regiment, built a defense in depth across that line that a modern engineer would recognize immediately. The anchor of it was a structure called the hornwork. A hornwork, in 18th century fortification, is two angled bastions joined by a connecting wall, projecting forward from the main line to cover the approach road. Charleston straddled the main highway into the city, and its remains are still visible today in Marion Square, in the middle of downtown. What made it unusual was the material. It was built largely of tabby. a regional concrete made from oyster shells, lime, sand, and water, cheap and abundant in a place with that much coastline. Tabby has an accidental military virtue. It is slightly porous, and rather than shattering the way dressed stone does under impact, it absorbs. A cannonball strikes Tabby and buries itself. The wall deforms instead of failing. During the siege, the Americans walled off the rear of the hornwork with earth, turning it into a self-contained final redoubt, a last position the garrison could fall back into if the outer line broke. Hessian officers who inspected it afterward described the gateway as bridged by a raised structure with clearance enough for a mounted man to ride under at a gallop. Running out from the hornwork, the main parapet crossed the entire peninsula, studded with redanes and gun batteries. Something over 200 cannon were mounted along it. But the parapet was only the last obstacle. In front of it, the engineers laid out a sequence designed specifically to break up an infantry assault before it ever reached a wall. An attacker would first hit 2 belts of abatis, felled trees, branches sharpened and angled outward, essentially 18th century barbed wire. Behind that, a ditch lined with driven stakes. Behind that, the centerpiece, a canal 18 feet across and 6 to 8 feet deep, cut across the neck and fed from a tidal creek off the Cooper. That canal is worth pausing on, because it was built using rice plantation technology. Low-country planters had spent generations mastering tidal water management, sluice gates, embankments, controlled flooding of fields on the tide. The same engineering was turned on the British. Water was admitted at high tide and then trapped, giving the city a permanent wet moat maintained by the ocean. Where the ground was awkward, they filled the gaps with chevaux de frise, timber beams studded with iron spikes, and with what the sources call wolf traps, concealed pits with sharpened stakes set in the bottom. Add it up, and the arithmetic of a frontal assault becomes obvious. British infantry would have to drain a canal under fire, hack through 2 lines of abatis under fire, cross a staked ditch under fire, avoid the pits, and then climb a parapet into point-blank canister from 200 guns. Clinton looked at that and made the only sane decision available to him. He would not attack it. He would dismantle it, slowly, from a distance, using mathematics. But before he could start, he had to get onto the peninsula at all. On the 29th of March, 1780, the British crossed the Ashley River. They did it upstream of the city near Drayton Hall, moving troops across in boats to the neck itself. It was the kind of operation that should have been contested. It was not. The American cavalry that might have made the crossing expensive was elsewhere, and the crossing went off essentially unopposed. I want to be careful here about how this gets narrated, because it is easy to make it sound more dramatic than the participants experienced it. Nobody in Charleston on the 29th of March believed the war had just ended. The mood in the city, by most accounts, was closer to grim resolve than panic. The defenses were strong, the garrison was reasonably confident, and reinforcements were understood to be marching south. But something had changed that could not be changed back. Charleston is a peninsula with one land approach. On the 28th of March, that approach was open. On the 29th, a British army was standing on it. This is the first of what I want to think of as the doors. Over the following 6 weeks, one exit after another closes. Some through fighting, some through decisions made hundreds of miles away, some through pure administrative accident. Almost none of them look decisive at the time. Each of them is irreversible. Door 1 was the neck. Within 3 days, the British had begun to make that permanent. On the night of the 1st of April, working in darkness roughly 800 yards from the American parapet, British engineers broke ground on their first parallel. If you have never seen a formal siege described properly, that phrase means nothing. It should. It is one of the most quietly terrifying concepts in military history, and it deserves a section of its own. A formal siege in the 18th century was less a battle than a construction project with an inevitable conclusion, and everyone involved knew it. The system had been codified a century earlier, largely by a French engineer named Vauban, and by 1780 it was so well understood that experienced officers on both sides could estimate, within days, how long a given fortress would last. That is not a figure of speech. Siege warfare had become predictable enough to be scheduled. Here's how it worked. The besieger begins by digging a trench parallel to the defender's wall at a distance far enough out to be safe from the defending artillery, usually 600 to 1,000 yards. This is the first parallel. It gives the attacking infantry a protected position and a place to mount guns. From the first parallel, the engineers dig forward toward the defenses. But they never dig straight at them, because a straight trench pointed at an enemy battery is a corridor down which that battery can fire. And a single well-aimed shot traveling the length of a packed trench is a catastrophe. So they dig in zigzags, angled saps that advance while never presenting a clear line back to the guns. The saps run forward a few hundred yards. Then the engineers turn and dig another lateral trench, the second parallel. Guns are dragged forward into it. The bombardment begins again, closer, heavier, more accurate. Then more saps. Then a third parallel, sometimes within yards of the defending wall. From there, the attackers can either breach the wall with concentrated fire or storm it across a distance short enough to survive. The defenders' options against this are limited and mostly unpleasant. You can shoot at the working parties, which is why almost all sapping was done at night. You can sortie, send infantry out to physically attack the trenches, kill the engineers, and wreck the works, which is costly and rarely more than a delay. Or you can wait for someone to come and lift the siege from outside. That last one is the only real answer. Sieges are broken by relief armies. If no relief army is coming, the siege has one ending, and the only variable is how many people die before the garrison commander admits it. What makes this genuinely grim is that everyone involved could see the timetable. The men behind the Charleston parapet could watch the British trenches creep closer each morning and calculate, roughly, how many mornings were left. The first British parallel was completed by the 10th of April. And on the 8th, 2 days before that, something had happened out in the harbor that removed the last realistic possibility of relief. The seaward defense of Charleston rested on two things: the guns of Fort Moultrie and a small Continental naval squadron under Commodore Abraham Whipple. Whipple was not a minor figure. He was a Rhode Island mariner with a long and genuinely audacious record. He had led the burning of the British customs schooner Gaspee in 1772, an act of open defiance 3 years before Lexington, and in 1779 he had taken a fortune out of a British Jamaica convoy. He was exactly the sort of man you would want holding a harbor. He had 9 vessels, and on paper it was a real force. The frigates Providence and Boston, the heavier Bricole carrying 44 guns, the Truite, the Queen of France, the General Moultrie, the Notre Dame. The original plan was to fight at the bar. Whipple's ships would anchor inside the sandbar at the harbor mouth and rake British warships as they struggled across the shallows, a position where a smaller squadron could inflict real damage on a larger one, because the larger one would be coming through a bottleneck 1 ship at a time, unable to bring its weight to bear. On the 20th of March, Arbuthnot's warships assembled off the bar, and Whipple looked at what was actually out there and concluded the position could not be held. Historians have argued about this decision for 2 centuries. The critical reading is that Whipple lost his nerve and gave away the one place where American naval force could have mattered. The sympathetic reading is that the disparity in firepower was simply too great, that a stand at the bar would have cost him his squadron in an afternoon and bought a few days at most, and that he made an unglamorous decision correctly. The sources do not settle it, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. What is certain is the consequence. The Royal Navy crossed the bar. On the 8th of April, our Arbuthnot ships ran the gauntlet past Fort Moultrie and into the inner harbor. The fort fired hard as they came. This was the same position that had wrecked a British squadron in 1776. But a ship under sail with a following wind is a fast-moving target, and the British took the punishment and kept going. Within an hour or so, they were inside. That was door 2, and it was the largest one. With the Royal Navy in the harbor, no relief force could arrive by sea. No supplies could come in. Nobody could get out by water in any organized way. Charleston was now a peninsula sealed on its land side by an army and on its water side by a fleet. Whipple's response was to destroy his own squadron. He ordered the Bricole, the Truite, the Queen of France, the General Moultrie, and the Notre Dame scuttled in the Cooper River between the city and Chutes Folly. As they settled onto the bottom, chevaux de frise were fixed to their decks and their spars were lashed together with cable and chain, turning 5 warships into a submerged spiked barrier. A boom to stop the British from simply sailing up the Cooper and shelling the city from behind. The guns came out of them first, and the crews came ashore. Several hundred sailors and dozens of heavy naval cannon were transferred into the land batteries, which is one reason the garrison's artillery was as strong as it was, and one reason the surrender figures are so contested. Were those men soldiers? It is worth stating plainly what this moment was. The scuttling in the Cooper River effectively ended the Continental Navy as an independent fighting force in the Revolution. It never recovered. And with the harbor gone, Sir Henry Clinton sent a letter into the city. On the 10th of April, with the first parallel finished and the fleet in the harbor, Clinton and Arbuthnot formally summoned the town to surrender. This was not a bluff or a courtesy. It was a legal and customary step in siege warfare, and it carried real weight. Under the conventions of the day, a garrison that surrendered at the first summons, before the attacker had spent blood and money reducing the place, could expect generous terms. A garrison that refused and forced the siege to continue forfeited that expectation. The longer you held out, the harsher the terms you could anticipate when you finally gave in. Every professional officer in Charleston understood this arithmetic. Lincoln refused. His reply is one of the few phrases from this campaign that survives in something close to his own words. He told the British that both duty and inclination required him to defend the city to the last extremity. There were reasons behind it that were not simply stubbornness. Colonel Abraham Buford was marching south with Virginia Continentals. Regiments from Maryland and Delaware under Baron Johann de Kalb, a formidable officer and a genuinely good one, were also on the road. If a relief force arrived in strength, the siege calculus changed completely. Lincoln was not defending a hopeless position out of pride. He was buying time against a specific expectation. The expectation was wrong. Buford's men were too few and too far. De Kalb's column was slowed by supply problems and would not arrive in time to matter. Neither Lincoln nor anyone in the city knew that on the 10th of April. There is also the political dimension, and it is unavoidable. Congress had pressed Lincoln hard to hold Charleston. South Carolina's commitment to the rebellion was politically doubted in Philadelphia. The state had been lukewarm in 1776, and there were persistent fears about which way it would go. Abandoning its capital without a fight risked losing the state outright. So Lincoln refused, and the British unmasked their batteries, and the artillery duel began in earnest. Work started immediately on the second parallel, which was finished by the 18th. 6 days after that summons, 30 miles to the north, a British cavalry column moved through swamp in complete darkness toward a sleeping American camp. Charleston still had one thread connecting it to the outside world, and it ran north across the Cooper River. Guarding it was Brigadier General Isaac Huger. The name is pronounced U.G. A Huguenot family named South Carolinians have said that way for 300 years. With about 500 men at Monk's Corner, some 30 miles above the city. His command was cavalry-heavy, the 1st and 3rd Continental Dragoons, Colonel Daniel Harry's South Carolina Horse, and what remained of Pulaski's Legion under a French officer, the Chevalier Pierre-François Vernier. The position mattered enormously. Huger was covering Biggin Bridge over the Cooper. That bridge was the supply route into Charleston, the courier route out of it, and, critically, the road an army would use if it ever decided to leave. Clinton understood this precisely. On the 13th of April, he sent 1,400 men north under Lieutenant Colonel James Webster, with Banastre Tarleton's British Legion at the front and Patrick Ferguson's American Volunteers behind. Tarleton, still short of horses from the Atlantic crossing, had a personal stake in the outcome that went beyond orders. What happened next was a disaster produced by ordinary, recognizable mistakes. Huger, for reasons that have never been satisfactorily explained, did not put out forward patrols. An army camped in front of an active enemy, covering the single most important bridge in the theater, was not watching the roads. He also deployed badly. His dragoons, under Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, a distant relative of the commander-in-chief and a genuinely fine cavalry officer, were posted in front of the bridge with militia and infantry behind. That is backwards. Cavalry are not a screening force in a static defense. They are shock troops and a mobile reserve. Infantry hold a bridgehead. Horsemen sleeping in the open in front of one are a target. And then the last error, which was not his fault, but sealed it. On the evening of the 13th, Tarleton's men intercepted a courier, an enslaved man carrying a letter from Huger to Lincoln. That letter laid out the American dispositions in detail. Tarleton now knew exactly where everyone was. At 3 in the morning on the 14th of April, the British Legion came through the swamp in silence and hit the camp at a full charge with drawn swords. There was no battle. There was a collapse. Men woke to horsemen already among them in the dark. The American dragoons were ridden down or scattered into the surrounding swamp. The militia near Biggin Church were dispersed by Ferguson's loyalists, almost as an afterthought. Huger and Washington both escaped, on foot through the marsh, in the dark, having lost everything they were commanding. The recorded American loss was 14 killed, 19 wounded, 64 captured. Small numbers. The consequences were enormous. The aftermath was ugly, and the sources are consistent enough about it that it should not be softened. Major Vernier, commanding the Pulaski Horse, was cut down after asking for quarter. There were also attempted assaults on women at a nearby plantation, serious enough that British officers intervened and arrests were made. Tarleton's reputation for savagery is sometimes overstated by later American writers, with an interest in overstating it. But it did not come from nowhere, and Monk's Corner is one of the places it came from. The material haul mattered more than the casualties. Tarleton took over 40 wagons of supplies and close to 100 prime dragoon horses. In a single night, he solved the mounting problem that had crippled him since the Atlantic crossing, and he did it using American horses. which meant he simultaneously destroyed the only mobile force the Americans had in the theater. That is door 3, and it is the one that actually kills the army. With Biggin Bridge gone, Clinton sent Cornwallis across the Cooper with 2,500 men to build a permanent cordon running down to the sea. When a scratch attempt to reassemble American cavalry was smashed by Tarleton again at Lanude's Ferry on the 6th of May, the last mounted force in South Carolina ceased to exist. The encirclement was now complete in every direction, which raises the question that hangs over this entire campaign. Lincoln had known for weeks that this was coming. Why was his army still inside the city? The answer is the most uncomfortable part of this story, and it is the part most popular accounts skip. By late March, before the British crossed the Ashley, Lincoln and effectively all of his senior Continental officers wanted to evacuate. Not to surrender, to withdraw the regular troops north across the Cooper while the route was still open, leave the city to whatever terms it could negotiate, and preserve the Southern Department as a fighting force. Militarily, this was not a close call. It was the correct decision by the standards of the age, by Washington's own doctrine, and by simple arithmetic. He was prevented. South Carolina's governor, John Rutledge, had been granted near dictatorial emergency powers by the legislature. On the 13th of April, the day before Monk's Corner, Rutledge slipped out of the city to preserve the state government and spent the following months moving around South Carolina with a printing press, issuing proclamations to prove that a legitimate government still existed. Whatever you think of leaving a besieged city, that decision probably kept the state's civil authority alive, but it left Charleston's civilian leadership in the hands of men considerably less flexible. Chief among them was Christopher Gadsden. Gadsden was a merchant, a radical, one of the founding agitators of the independence movement in the South, the leader of Charleston's Liberty Boys, and the man whose name is on the coiled rattlesnake flag. He had spent 15 years pushing South Carolina toward revolution. He was not going to preside over the abandonment of its capital. When Lincoln raised evacuation, Gadsden and the remaining Privy Council refused outright. And the refusal did not stay rhetorical. Around the 25th of April, as Lincoln again pressed the case, Gadsden and armed civilians actively obstructed any movement of the Continental regiments. The threat, made explicitly, was that the city's militia would be turned against the Continentals if they attempted to leave, and that the boats needed for a crossing would be destroyed first. Think about what that actually means. An American general, commanding an American army, was told by American civilians that if he tried to save his troops, they would burn his transport and shoot at him. It is worth being fair to the civilians, because it is easy to make them villains, and the reality was more human than that. These were people whose entire wealth was in the city. Houses, warehouses, ships, plantations up the river, and enslaved people they regarded as property. British occupation meant confiscation, and confiscation meant ruin. They also, not unreasonably, believed that an army which marched away was an army that had abandoned them to an enemy that had already shown at Savannah what occupation looked like. They were protecting what they had. They were also, without understanding it, destroying the only force in the South capable of eventually getting it back. And Lincoln yielded. That is his responsibility, and he carried it for the rest of his life. A more forceful commander, a Nathaniel Greene, who would arrive in the South later that year and who understood precisely this trade-off, would have marched out and let the politicians scream. Lincoln was not that man. He was a careful, dutiful officer facing armed obstruction from the government he served, and he could not bring himself to make the break. So the army stayed. and the British kept digging. By the 21st of April, Lincoln had run out of hope for a relief column and made one final attempt to salvage something. He proposed a trade. The British could have Charleston, the city, its fortifications, its stores, if the Continental troops were permitted to march out and go free. It was, from his position, a rational offer. It gave Clinton everything the campaign had been mounted to obtain. What it withheld was the army. Clinton refused, and he was right to. Refusing was the entire point. This is where you can see, quite clearly, that Clinton understood the strategic situation better than the men in London who had sent him. Charleston as a city was worth a great deal. A port, a base, a symbol, a customs house. But an American army loose in the Carolina interior was worth more to the Americans than the city was to anyone. Clinton had spent 4 years watching Washington evaporate into the countryside and reappear somewhere inconvenient. He was not going to pay for a siege and then hand the enemy back its field army. He wanted both. He was in a position to have both. He said no. On the 23rd, Cornwallis crossed the Cooper and began sealing the eastern approaches. On the 24th, the Americans mounted a sortie, a raid out of the works into the forward British trenches. And it went about as well as sorties usually do. They inflicted perhaps 50 casualties, took a handful of prisoners, and came back. The British lost a night's work. The siege was not delayed in any way that mattered. There is a small, sad detail attached to that raid. The one American killed in it was Thomas Moultrie, brother of General William Moultrie, the hero of 1776, the man the fort in the harbor was named for. A war that had begun for the Moultrie family with the most famous American victory in the South ended for one of them in an inconsequential trench raid during its worst defeat. After the 24th, the character of the siege changed. There were no more offers, no more sorties of consequence, no more expectations of rescue. What was left was 3 weeks of being slowly and methodically taken apart. We know more about those 3 weeks than about almost any other siege of this war. And the reason is worth pausing on, because it shapes everything you have heard so far and everything that follows. The best eyewitness accounts of the Siege of Charleston were written by Germans. If that seems odd, it's because the standard telling of the Revolution flattens the British side into a single red mass. In reality, something close to a third of the troops Clinton brought south were German. Men from Hesse-Kassel, Brunswick, Ansbach, and a handful of other principalities, hired out by their rulers under treaty and shipped across the Atlantic to fight a war that had nothing to do with them. The word people use for them, Hessians, is a convenient inaccuracy. Many were not from Hesse. They were also not mercenaries in the modern sense. They were regular soldiers of their own states, conscripted or enlisted at home, whose governments had rented out entire regiments for cash. The soldiers themselves saw very little of that money. They were, however, extremely good. The unit that matters most at Charleston was the Jaeger Corps. The word means hunter, and that was literally the recruiting base: gamekeepers, foresters, and huntsmen, men who had grown up shooting rifled weapons at moving targets in woodland. In an era when the standard infantry musket was a smoothbore that could not reliably hit an individual man at 100 yards, the Jaegers carried short rifled guns and could. They were used the way light infantry and marksmen have been used ever since, screening, scouting, and killing specific people at inconvenient distances. 2 of their officers kept journals, and both survive. Johann Heinrichs, a captain of Jaegers, wrote a diary that is unusually technical and unusually honest. He records distances, engineering details, weather, and the mistakes made by his own side, which is precisely why historians trust him. A man writing propaganda does not include the observation that his army sighted a trench badly and got people killed for it. Johann Ewald was another Jaeger officer, and his journals across the whole American war are among the finest first-hand military documents of the 18th century. He was a professional soldier's professional soldier, observant, unsentimental, and capable of describing horror without decorating it. Neither man had any stake in the American national story. Neither was writing for publication in London. That combination, expert observers with no dog in the fight, is why so much of what we can say about the day-to-day reality of this siege comes filtered through German. It also means that when we describe what the fighting felt like, we are largely looking through the loophole of a sandbag position from the British side, watching American gunners. But there were tens of thousands of people on the other side of that parapet who were not soldiers at all. Charleston in the spring of 1780 contained somewhere around 12,000 people who had no part in the fighting and no way to leave. Once the British crossed the Ashley and the Royal Navy entered the harbor, the city was sealed for civilians as completely as it was for soldiers. There was no evacuation of non-combatants, no arrangement for women and children to be passed through the lines. The population that had been there in March was still there in May, underneath the bombardment. Food ran down steadily. A city of that size imported almost everything it ate, by water and by road, and both were gone. Meat disappeared first. Rice, the crop the entire local economy was built on, held out longer because there was rice in the warehouses. But a diet of rice and not much else does specific things to people over 6 weeks. Disease moved faster than hunger. It always does in a besieged town. Crowding, fouled water, and the heat of a low-country spring produced the usual results. And the sources record sickness, thinning the garrison as effectively as British artillery. Then there was the shelling itself, which had a rhythm the civilians learned. Artillery fire came in concentrations, usually at night, usually against the works. But a mortar shell fired at a parapet that goes longlands in a street. People adapted the way people always do. They moved to the southern end of the peninsula, furthest from the guns. They slept in cellars. They learned which parts of town were safe at which hours. None of that helped on the 11th of May, and we'll get there shortly. There is one part of the city's population whose experience is almost entirely missing from the record, and it should be named rather than skipped. Charleston had a large enslaved population, and South Carolina as a whole had a black majority. Enslaved people built the fortifications, the canal, the parapets. The abatis were dug and dragged into place largely by forced labor. They worked under fire. They died under fire. They also had a set of choices nobody else in the city had. The British had issued a proclamation the previous year offering freedom to enslaved people who left rebel owners and reached British lines. And Charleston sat inside a British cordon. Some crossed. The white population's awareness of this possibility, the fear that the enemy outside was offering something the city could not match, sits underneath the politics of the siege without ever being stated openly in the surviving documents. We do not have their journals. There are no Heinrichs and Ewald for the enslaved of Charleston. What we have is an absence, and the absence is not accidental. Meanwhile, out on the neck, the trench line came closer every night. The middle weeks of the siege produced almost no events worth a headline and an enormous amount of misery. And this is where the Hessian diaries become genuinely valuable. because they record what the fighting was actually like at eye level. The most persistent danger was not artillery, it was rifles. The Hessian Jaeger companies were armed with rifled muskets, slower to load than the smoothbore weapons carried by most infantry, but accurate at ranges where a smoothbore was essentially throwing lead in a general direction. Their job in a siege was specific: kill the enemy gunners. Henrichs describes the method. The riflemen built up firing positions on the trench parapet using sandbags, leaving narrow loopholes to shoot through. From those positions, at a range of a couple of 100 yards, they watched the American embrasures, the openings in the parapet through which the cannon fired, and waited. Loading an 18th century cannon requires men to expose themselves at the muzzle. Every time an American gun crew went through its drill, a Hessian rifleman was watching the gap. The American response was mantelets. Heavy wooden shutters hung over the embrasures, closed while the gun was loaded and swung aside to fire. The British answer to that was bar shot, projectiles designed to smash timber, which broke the mantelets apart and left the gunners exposed again. It was an escalating, grinding technical exchange, and men died in it every day for weeks. The Americans were not passive. Henrichs recorded one incident with something close to shock. An American salvo of 13 guns, fired together, struck directly beneath the Jaeger sandbag positions and blew the whole construction into the air, tumbling men and debris down into the trench. He also recorded a serious British engineering failure, which is the kind of thing that makes a diary trustworthy. Nobody inventing a heroic narrative includes their own side's mistakes in this much detail. The second parallel, he noted, had been sighted badly. It was exposed to enfilading fire from the American left, because the engineers had not built enough traverses. The earthen barriers placed across a trench at intervals specifically to stop a shot from traveling down its length. And the Americans knew exactly when to exploit it, because deserters had told them that the British relieved their trench guard at 3 in the morning. So every night, in the dark, American gunners fired ricochet rounds down the length of that road, skipping shot along the ground into men who had no cover from that angle and were changing shift on a fixed schedule. That is the texture of the middle of this siege. Sandbags and loopholes, shattered shutters, ricochet fire at 3 in the morning against a predictable timetable. No glory in any of it, and a steady, unremarkable accumulation of dead men on both sides. Meanwhile, the trenches came forward, and in the first week of May, they reached the water. Between the 6th and 8th of May, the British completed their third parallel. That is the end stage. The third parallel put heavy siege guns within a few yards of the American works, close enough that the two armies could hear each other, close enough that a storming party would cross the remaining ground in seconds rather than minutes. And in the course of getting there, British engineers did the thing the Americans had built the whole defense to prevent. They drained the canal. That 18-foot ditch, filled and held by tidal gates borrowed from Ricefield Engineering, had been the centerpiece of the landward defense. British working parties cut into the embankment at the western end and let it out. Once it was dry, they pushed through the outer works entirely, taking the forward defenses near what is now the intersection of King and John Streets. The obstacle belt was gone. What remained between the British Army and the city was a parapet and the men standing on it. On the 7th of May, Fort Moultrie surrendered. There is something quietly devastating about that. This was the fort that had humiliated the Royal Navy in 1776. The reason the palmetto is on the state flag, the founding symbol of South Carolina's defiance. By May 1780, it had been reduced to a garrison of a couple of hundred men, cut off with British warships behind it and British troops on the island. It surrendered without a fight, because there was no fight left available to it. 4 years earlier, that fort had turned back an empire. Now it was a formality. The last exit was closed on both water and land. The interior defenses were breached. The relief columns were not coming, and by now everyone inside knew it. On the 8th of May, Clinton sent in his final demand, unconditional surrender. And Lincoln, with nothing left to bargain with, tried to bargain anyway. For the one thing that had no material value at all. What Lincoln asked for, on the 8th of May, was the honors of war. We need to define that, because to modern ears it sounds like ceremonial fluff, and it was not. Under the honors of war, a defeated garrison marched out of its position with its colors flying, its drums beating, and its muskets shouldered, and only laid down its arms at a designated place after leaving the works. Officers kept their swords and their personal property. The defeated side was permitted to play a tune of its own choosing, traditionally a march belonging to the enemy, which was a small, sharp piece of defiance built into the ritual. The whole thing was a formal statement made in public by the winning commander that the losing army had fought well and remained an army. It was the difference between being defeated and being disgraced. Clinton refused. He was, again, being coldly logical. Lincoln had turned down the summons on the 10th of April. Under the conventions everyone was operating within, that forfeited the claim to generous terms. Clinton had then spent a month and a great deal of money digging his way to the parapet. He was not now going to hand back a ceremonial dignity he had, by the rules of the era, won the right to withhold. Lincoln hesitated. It was a strange thing to hesitate over. Thousands of lives against a drumbeat. But the hesitation was real, and Clinton ended it in the most direct way available. On the 11th of May, the British batteries and the Royal Navy opened up together, and this time they used heated shot. The technique is exactly what it sounds like. Solid iron cannonballs are placed in a furnace and heated until they glow, then carried to the guns with tongs loaded on top of a wet wad to keep them from touching the powder, and fired. When a red-hot ball lodges in timber, it does not simply break it. It sets it alight from the inside, in a place nobody can reach with a bucket. Charleston was a city of wood. Houses, shops, warehouses, church steeples, wharves. Fires broke out across the city. And here the psychological character of the siege inverted completely. Because the people begging Lincoln to give up were the same people who had refused to let him leave. Christopher Gadsden, who had blocked the evacuation, who had threatened to turn the militia on the Continentals, whose position for 6 weeks had been that the city must be held, now petitioned the general to surrender immediately, before Charleston burned to the ground. I don't think there is a way to narrate that which is not brutal to the civilians involved, and I am not sure they deserve to be spared it. Their houses had been the reason the army could not go. Their houses were now on fire, and the army that could have been 50 miles away was still standing on the parapet with them. Lincoln had no reinforcements, no fortifications, no fleet, no political support, and now no civilian will behind him. On the 12th of May, 1780, he surrendered. The formal capitulation took place at the American Works on the Neck, near where Marion Square is today. The garrison marched out. The colors were cased, furled, wrapped, carried closed rather than flying. The drums did not beat a British or German march. There was no defiant tune. The men walked out of their own defenses in silence and stacked their weapons where they were told to. The tally the British recorded was 5,466 men, That figure deserves a moment of honesty, because you will find wildly different numbers depending on where you look, from around 3,300 to 7,000. The variation is not sloppiness. It is a disagreement about definitions. The lowest counts include only Continental regulars under arms. The higher counts add militia, officers, the sailors who had come ashore from Whipple's scuttled squadron, armed townsmen, and in some tallies, enslaved laborers who had worked the fortifications. In other words, the sources cannot agree on how many people surrendered at Charleston because they cannot agree on who counted as part of the army. That question, who belongs to a nation's fighting force, was unsettled in 1780, and the arithmetic still shows it. What is not in dispute is what came with them. 7 generals, something over 300 pieces of artillery, roughly 6,000 muskets, enormous quantities of powder and shot, the captured frigate Providence, which the Royal Navy took into service, and the Southern Department of the Continental Army in its entirety. The combat casualties across the whole 42-day siege were remarkably low. On the American side, 89 killed and 138 wounded. On the British, roughly comparable. Fewer than 300 dead in 6 weeks in an operation that destroyed an army. That is what a properly conducted siege was designed to achieve. It is also why officers of that era regarded siegecraft as a civilized branch of warfare. A view that requires you not to look too closely at what happened to the prisoners afterward. The longest siege of the Revolutionary War was over. It had lasted 42 days, and the single deadliest hour of the entire affair had not happened yet. Before we get to that, we need to follow the thread of the drumbeat, because it does not end in Charleston. The denial of the honors of war was noticed. It was noticed bitterly, and by everyone. To the officers of the Continental Army, it was not simply a defeat. It was a public statement by the British commander-in-chief that they were not a real army, that the war was a rebellion and its soldiers were not soldiers. That interpretation was not paranoid. It was the point. Britain had spent 5 years refusing to concede that the thing it was fighting was a war between nations, and Clinton had just made the refusal ceremonial. 17 months later, in October 1781, Charles Cornwallis found himself sealed into a peninsula at Yorktown, with a Franco-American army across the neck and a French fleet in the water behind him. If that arrangement sounds familiar, it should. It is Charleston, reproduced almost exactly, with the roles exchanged. Cornwallis asked for terms. Washington's written reply survives, and the relevant sentence is precise. He specified that the surrendering army would receive the same honors that had been granted to the garrison of Charleston. That is all it says. It did not need to say more. Every officer on both sides knew exactly what had been granted at Charleston, which was nothing. So the British marched out of Yorktown with their colors cased. They were not permitted a defiant march of the enemies. It was the same humiliation, returned in the same form, in writing, by a commander who had been keeping the account for a year and a half. And there is one more turn. Cornwallis did not attend the surrender ceremony. He reported himself unwell and sent Brigadier General Charles O'Hara to hand over the sword in his place. O'Hara first offered it to the French commander, Rochambeau, who declined and directed him to Washington. Washington also declined. He would not personally receive a surrender from a subordinate, and directed O'Hara to his own second-in-command. His second-in-command that day was Benjamin Lincoln. The man who had surrendered an entire army at Charleston received the sword of the British Army at Yorktown. Whether Washington arranged that deliberately is not documented anywhere I can find, and I would be cautious about asserting it. But it is very hard to look at the arrangement and believe it was accidental. That is the long arc, Now, back to the 12th of May, and to a warning that a Hessian officer gave and nobody listened to. After the surrender, the captured weapons had to be collected and stored. 5,000 to 6,000 muskets were carried to a powder magazine in the city and stacked inside. The work was done fast and, by every account we have, carelessly. A Hessian officer, the sources are not entirely consistent on which one, and it may have been more than one, raised a specific alarm. Many of those muskets, particularly the militia weapons, were probably still loaded. The garrison had spent the previous night expecting a final British assault. Men who expect to be stormed at dawn do not unload their weapons. The warning was disregarded. The arms continued to be thrown onto the piles. One of them went off. The spark reached the powder stored in the magazine, around 180 barrels of it. The explosion tore the building apart and threw its contents into the sky over the city. Shattered musket barrels, ramrods, bayonets, burning timber, and roofing came down across the surrounding streets and rooftops. Johann Ewald, another Hessian officer whose journals are among the best sources we have for this war, described the aftermath in the streets in terms that are difficult to read. People burned past recognition. People still alive and moving, in ways he could only describe by comparing them to worms. The dead included British artillerymen, Hessian grenadiers, American prisoners, and civilians who happened to be nearby. Among the worst affected were people in the neighboring jail. Prisoners held for minor offenses, including, in the language of the sources, the mentally ill and enslaved Black South Carolinians, who were chained and could not move, and were killed where they were held. The exact toll cannot be established. The most commonly cited estimate is well over 200 dead, and that figure carries real uncertainty. But hold it against the siege casualties. 89 Americans killed in 42 days of bombardment, sniping, and trench fighting. Then, after the surrender, in a matter of seconds, more than twice that number of people killed by an accident during the paperwork. The deadliest moment of the Siege of Charleston occurred after the Siege of Charleston was over, and it killed prisoners, victors, and bystanders without distinction. I find that the hardest detail in this entire campaign, and it is also the one that most reliably gets left out. The men who marched out on the 12th of May largely disappear from the record, and their fate was considerably worse than the tidy casualty tables suggest. Officers were generally paroled, released on their sworn word not to fight until formally exchanged. Militiamen were mostly paroled too, on condition of not taking up arms again, which many of them later did anyway, and which the British used as justification for hanging some of them. The Continental regulars, roughly 2,500 men, were held. Many went on to prison ships in the harbor. The prison hulks of the Revolution are among the worst things in the war and among the least discussed. They were decommissioned vessels, stripped and anchored, packed far beyond capacity, without adequate ventilation, sanitation, food, or medical care. Disease moved through them constantly. The death rate was appalling. Across the war as a whole, more Americans are generally reckoned to have died in British captivity than in combat. We do not know how many of the Charleston Continentals survived. We do not, in most cases, know their names. There was no systematic record kept of who died on those ships, and the men who could have written it down were dying alongside everyone else. There is another group whose fate is even less documented. Under a proclamation issued the previous year, the British offered freedom to enslaved people who left rebel owners and came into British lines. Thousands across the South took it, and many did so at Charleston. Some gained genuine freedom and eventually left with the British in 1782. Many others were seized as property by British officers or died of camp diseases. or were re-enslaved when the war ended. The records for these people are fragmentary, kept mostly by the people who claim to own them. And the truth about most individual outcomes is simply gone. That is what the number 5,466 actually contains. And it is worth saying before we move to consequences. Because the consequences are usually where this battle gets interesting. And it is easy to step over the people on the way there. In the weeks after the surrender, the British Southern strategy appeared to be working perfectly. With the Continental Army in the south destroyed, the remaining American positions in the interior collapsed almost without resistance. Backcountry garrisons surrendered as word arrived. British columns fanned out and established a chain of fortified posts across South Carolina. 96, Camden, Georgetown, Cheraw. The state was under occupation within a month. Then, on the 29th of May, Tarleton caught Abraham Buford's Virginia Continentals, the relief column that had never arrived, at the Waxhaws near the North Carolina line. What happened there is disputed in its particulars and undisputed in its effect. Buford's men were ridden down, and a large number were killed or cut apart after resistance had effectively ended. Whether Tarleton lost control of his men after his horse was shot from under him, or whether it was deliberate, has been argued for 2 centuries. The phrase that came out of it, asking for Tarleton's quarter, passed into American usage, meaning no quarter at all. Clinton, satisfied the South was secure, sailed back to New York on the 5th of June, leaving Cornwallis in command with orders to push into North Carolina. And this is the moment the entire British plan quietly broke. The Southern strategy had a single load-bearing assumption: that once the rebel army was gone, the loyal population would rise, arm itself, and hold the country. That is what everything rested on. The regulars would move north. The loyalists would police what was left behind. The Loyalists did not materialize in anything like the numbers London had been promised. And the occupation itself, the loyalty oaths, the confiscations, the conduct of units like Tarleton's Legion, did something the British had not anticipated. It took a population that had been genuinely divided and politically lukewarm, and made large parts of it furious. What replaced the Continental Army in South Carolina was not nothing. It was something the British had no doctrine for. Partisan bands formed around a handful of local commanders. Thomas Sumter, whose house had been burned by British troops. Andrew Pickens, who had accepted a parole and then repudiated it after his property was destroyed. And Francis Marion. Marion's presence in the war at all is a piece of luck so absurd it would be rejected in fiction. During the siege, he had been at a dinner party in Charleston, where the host, following a custom of the time, locked the doors to prevent guests from leaving before the toasts were finished. Marion, who did not drink much, escaped through an upstairs window and broke his leg doing it. He was evacuated from the city as an invalid before the encirclement closed. A broken ankle at a drinking party is the reason the Swamp Fox was not among the 5,466. These men did not fight battles. They ambushed supply convoys, cut couriers, destroyed isolated outposts, and vanished into terrain that British regulars could not operate in. They made the occupation of the interior enormously expensive and eventually impossible to sustain. Meanwhile, Congress, without consulting Washington, sent Horatio Gates south to build a new Southern army. Gates was the general credited with Saratoga, which was largely undeserved, and he proceeded to demonstrate why. He marched his men through country with almost no food, on a route his own officers advised against. He fed them at one point on green corn and molasses, which did to them roughly what you would expect on the night before a battle. He put untrained militia on his left, directly opposite the best British regulars on the field. And he did it without apparently considering what would happen. At Camden, on the 16th of August, 1780. What happened was that the militia broke on first contact, and the Continental regulars on the right were destroyed piecemeal. Baron de Kalb, the officer whose column had been marching to relieve Charleston, was hit 11 times, died of it 3 days later. Gates himself rode off the field and did not stop. He covered roughly 180 miles in 3 days, which contemporaries noted with a sarcasm that has followed him ever since. It was the second American army lost in the South in 3 months. Then Congress asked Washington to choose, and Washington sent Nathanael Greene. Greene understood the thing Lincoln had correctly seen and had not been permitted to act on. He never risked his army as a whole. He did something that violated conventional doctrine and worked. In the face of a superior enemy, he divided his force, sending Daniel Morgan west while he took the rest east, daring Cornwallis to chase both. Cornwallis chased both. Morgan destroyed Tarleton at Cowpens. Greene retreated 400 miles across 3 states, always just ahead, burning out British supply lines with the distance itself. He lost almost every battle he fought and won the campaign, which is a sentence that only makes sense if you understand what Charleston had taught. In October 1780, at Kings Mountain, a loyalist force under Patrick Ferguson, the same Ferguson who had ridden with Tarleton to Monk's Corner, was surrounded by backcountry militia and destroyed. Ferguson was killed. In January 1781, at Cowpens, Daniel Morgan trapped Tarleton's legion and annihilated it. In March, at Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis won a battle that cost him a quarter of his army and left him unable to hold the Carolinas at all. So he marched north into Virginia, looking for a decision he could not find in the South. And in the autumn of 1781, he put his army onto a peninsula with water on 3 sides and 1 way out. The chain from Charleston to Yorktown is not a metaphor. It is a sequence of decisions, each following from the last, beginning with the most complete British victory of the war. Before we ask why this battle vanished, it's worth following the people through, because the later lives are frequently stranger than the campaign. Benjamin Lincoln was exchanged in November 1780 and returned to duty. He was at Yorktown 11 months later, receiving the sword. After the war, Washington made him the first Secretary at War under the Confederation. And then, in 1787, he was given a command that carries a bitter symmetry. Shays' Rebellion had broken out in western Massachusetts. Indebted farmers, many of them veterans, rising against foreclosures and a state government they believed had abandoned them. The force raised to put them down was paid for by Boston merchants protecting their property. Its commander was Benjamin Lincoln. 7 years after being trapped in a city by wealthy men defending their assets, he was leading an army raised by wealthy men defending their assets against former Continental soldiers. He handled it with restraint, and the rising ended with relatively little blood. He died in 1810 in the town where he was born at 77. Henry Clinton got the thing he wanted least. After Yorktown, he and Cornwallis conducted a public war of blame in print, each publishing his version of who had lost America. Clinton had the better documentation and lost the argument anyway, because he was an unlikable man defending an indefensible outcome. He died in 1795, having never recovered his reputation, still writing. Cornwallis, remarkably, did recover his. Losing an army at Yorktown ought to have finished him. Instead, he went on to become Governor General of India, where he won a war and reformed an administration, and later Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, where he suppressed a rebellion and then argued for Catholic emancipation on the grounds that suppression alone would not hold. He died in India in 1805. He remains one of the few commanders in history to lose a nation and be promoted. Banastre Tarleton was destroyed as a soldier at Cowpens in January 1781, where Daniel Morgan read his aggression perfectly and used it against him. He went home, was elected to Parliament, sat there for over 20 years, and became one of the most persistent voices in Britain arguing against the abolition of the slave trade, his Liverpool constituency being what it was. He wrote a self-serving history of the Southern Campaign. He died a full general at 78, having never fought again. Patrick Ferguson did not get an afterword. He was killed at King's Mountain in October 1780, 5 months after Monk's Corner, shot from his horse while trying to rally loyalists against backcountry riflemen. His body was reportedly treated badly. The war in the Carolinas had by then become something neither side controlled. Christopher Gadsden, who had blocked the evacuation, was arrested by the British and shipped to St. Augustine, where he spent nearly a year in close confinement, much of it in a cell. For refusing a parole he considered dishonorable. Whatever you conclude about his judgment in April 1780, he paid a price for his convictions that most of his fellow councilmen did not. He returned to South Carolina, declined the governorship on grounds of ill health, and argued afterward for leniency toward loyalists. He died in 1805. William Moultrie, captured with the army, was eventually exchanged and later served 2 terms as governor of South Carolina. Isaac Huger, whose failure to post pickets at Monk's Corner helped seal the city, continued to serve and fought under Greene at Guilford Courthouse. Abraham Whipple, who sank his own fleet, ended up farming in Ohio and died there in relative obscurity, a man remembered for burning one British schooner in 1772 and forgotten for everything after. And Francis Marion, who left the city with a broken ankle, became the most famous soldier the campaign produced without ever having been present at the battle. So why has almost nobody heard of it? Part of the answer is the obvious one. It is a defeat, and national memory is selective. The American Revolution, as it is popularly told, is a story of improbable victories and heroic endurance. Charleston is neither. It is a well-conducted professional operation by a competent enemy against an army that was outmaneuvered before the first shot. But there are more specific reasons, and they are more interesting. Sieges do not narrate well. There is no charge, no line breaking, no single moment where everything turns. There is a trench that gets closer every day for 6 weeks. The drama of Charleston is cumulative and procedural drama does not survive compression into a paragraph in a textbook. There is also no usable hero. Lincoln is not a villain. He was competent. He made the correct assessment, and he was overruled. But he is not a figure anyone wants to build a story around. Moultrie's great moment was 4 years earlier. Marion's was still to come. The men who behaved worst were not British. They were American civilians defending their property. And that is not a story anyone wanted to tell in the 19th century when the national narrative was being assembled. There is a geographic factor too. Revolutionary memory in the United States was constructed largely in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, and it centered on the battles fought there. The Southern Campaign, which is arguably where the war was actually decided, has always been the second half of the story that people stop reading. And then, most powerfully, there is 1861. Charleston's national memory was comprehensively overwritten by the Civil War. Fort Sumter sits in the same harbor that Arbuthnot's ships forced in 1780. When Americans think about Charleston and war, they think about April 1861, not May 1780. The later conflict occupied the same ground and took the memory with it. The result is that the largest surrender in American military history for 82 years, the destruction of an entire field army, and the operation that set in motion everything leading to Yorktown, is a footnote, while battles that decided far less are on the currency. Which brings us back to where we started, and to the silence. There are a handful of things this campaign demonstrates that have not stopped being true, and they are worth stating plainly before we close. The first concerns the relationship between armies and the things they defend. Lincoln's dilemma was not unusual. It is one of the permanent problems of war. An army exists to protect people and places, but the moment it ties itself to a specific place, it can be found, fixed, and destroyed. The Charleston garrison stopped being a threat to the British the instant it committed to holding ground it could not leave. Every commander since has faced some version of this, and the ones who get it right are usually accused of cowardice at the time. The second is about political control of military decisions, which is genuinely difficult and does not have a clean answer. Civilian authority over the military is not a flaw in a republic. It is the point of one. But Charleston shows what happens when civilian authority is exercised by people with a direct financial interest in the outcome, under panic, with no accountability for the military consequences. Gadsden and the Privy Council were not tyrants. They were property owners making a rational calculation about their own assets, and they had the legal standing to enforce it. The system worked exactly as designed and produced a catastrophe. The third is about the limits of destroying an enemy army. This is the one the British got most badly wrong, and it is the lesson that has been relearned most often since. Clinton believed that eliminating organized American resistance in the South would end resistance in the South. What it actually did was remove the only structure capable of channeling that resistance into something conventional, negotiable, and defeatable. What replaced it was harder to fight, impossible to catch, and answered to nobody who could sign a surrender. Armies can be beaten. Populations are a different problem, and a captured city does not solve it. There is a straight line from the assumptions of the Southern strategy to a great many later occupations that began with total tactical success and ended with an exhausted expeditionary force wondering where the enemy went. The fourth is smaller and more practical. Almost every decisive moment in this campaign turned on information. Tarleton won at Monk's Corner because he read a captured letter. The American gunners killed British troops efficiently because deserters told them the relief schedule. Heinrichs noted the engineering flaw in the second parallel because he was a professional who looked. The dramatic elements of a siege are the guns. The determining elements are almost always the things somebody knew and somebody else did not. And the last one is about victory itself. Charleston was flawless. Clinton did everything correctly, took the objective, destroyed the enemy force, and paid almost nothing for it. It was the best executed British operation of the entire war. It was also the beginning of the end for them. And the two facts are not in tension. They are the same fact. The completeness of the victory is what produced the miscalculation, because it confirmed a theory that was wrong, and there is nothing more dangerous than a wrong theory that has just been proved right. 5,466 men, 7 generals, 311 guns, 42 days. What actually strikes me about Charleston, after all of it, is not the scale of the loss. It is how thoroughly everyone involved got what they asked for, and how badly it worked out. The civilians of Charleston asked for their city to be defended, and it was, and it burned anyway, and they lost it along with the army that might have retaken it sooner. Lincoln asked for a delay in which relief might arrive, and got 6 weeks in which it did not. Clinton asked for a total victory, the city and the army, without concession, and got it precisely, and it destroyed the strategy it was supposed to prove. He denied a beaten enemy the sound of a drum, and 17 months later, the sentence he had written was read back to his own second-in-command at Yorktown, by an army that had not forgotten. That is what makes this battle worth 2 hours. Not that it was a disaster. Plenty of battles were disasters. It is that it was a flawless success that functioned as a disaster for the side that won it within a year. The ruins are mostly gone. Part of the hornwork still stands in Marion Square in the middle of downtown Charleston, and most of the people walking past it every day do not know what it is. Fort Moultrie is still on Sullivan's Island, though the fort standing there now is a later structure. The canal is under streets. Somewhere in the mud of the Cooper River, the hulls of 5 Continental warships are still where Abraham Whipple sank them. And in a field near the neck, on a hot afternoon in May 1780, an American army walked out of its own works with its flags wrapped up and its drums quiet, and stacked its muskets and went into captivity, and most of its names were never written down. They were denied a tune. Washington remembered. He made sure it was paid back in the same words, on a different peninsula, with the general who had lost it standing there to accept the sword. Sometimes an army loses everything except the account. And sometimes the account is enough.